Good afternoon, attendees of this colloquium. I am Abigail Payne, the Ronald Henderson Professor and Director of the Melbourne Institute, Applied Economic and Social Research in the Faculty of Business and Economics. Let me extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you. I am joining you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Let me acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Viet Nguyen, a senior research fellow at the Melbourne Institute. Viet, along with his colleagues, are the drivers of the survey and analysis that form the Melbourne Institute Westpac Consumer Sentiment Survey. Today, his presentation is focused on the critical policy components and understanding consumer sentiment, namely the importance of capturing heterogeneity, or the differences in opinions and backgrounds of those who make up the Australian population. The current pandemic has proven once again the role of sentiment as a vital and timely indicator of the health of the economy. This is particularly evident in the household sector due to the close link between consumer sentiment and consumption. Viet is responsible for the day-to-day management of the Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Sentiment Survey and its reports. His main research interest is in how households form economic expectations and how these expectations map into actual economic outcomes. Viet also has extensive research expertise in indicators of economic activity and in the macroeconomic modeling of national and global economics with a focus on the modeling and measuring links across economies and financial markets. His research has been published in major international journals such as the Journal of Monetary Economics, the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, the Journal of Applied Econometrics, and the Journal of Financial Markets. This colloquium is one method we use to present the knowledge and insights of our Melbourne Institute researchers to inform and shape economic and social policy in Australia. Viet will speak for approximately 25 minutes. This will be followed by question and answers from you, the audience. Let me remind you of a few housekeeping matters. It is being recorded, and to handle questions and comments, I am relying on the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen if you are using Zoom. If you are using Slido, please submit your questions in the box on the right-hand side of your screen. You can submit questions at any time through these functions. Now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Viet.
Hi, everyone. In today's talk, I will present the result from one of my recent research. And the titles of today's talk is Capturing Heterogeneity in Consumer Sentiment. By heterogeneity, I mean, I want to capture the difference in consumer sentiment among consumers within the same household group, or the difference in sentiment between different household groups. By household group here, I mean a consumer that share similar characteristics. For example, consumer within an age group or consumer who are under financial stress. So in today's talk, after the brief introductions, I'll provide some information about the consumer survey and the consumer sentiment index. For those of you who are not familiar with the consumer survey and the consumer sentiment index, then I'll move on to the main part of the talk, which is to capture the difference in consumer sentiment. And to do that, I propose a new approach. I call the density approach, in order to capture the difference within a group of consumer or between different group of consumer. And then I would end with some concluding remark. So the Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Survey and the Consumer Sentiment Index have been a very valuable source of information to monitor economic activities in consumer sectors at Australian public and private institutions. And the main values of the Consumer Sentiment Index and the Consumer Survey is the leading informations about future activities in the household sector. And therefore, these data have been used widely at public and private institutions in Australia, including the Reserve Bank of Australia, the federal and the state treasuries, major financial institutions, and as well major data providers such as Bloomberg and Thomson Reuters. So our research will offer an additional tool to complement the current use of the popular Consumer Sentiment Index. And in particular, our approach will provide further insights into consumer sentiment, especially the difference in the sentiment among consumers within a group or between different consumer groups. And this information will help with the monitoring task and the decision making at both public and private institutions in Australia. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Consumer Survey and Consumer Sentiment Index, then the obvious question that you will ask is, why do we measure consumer sentiment, right? And to answer these questions, we need to go back all the way to the Great Depressions in the early 1930s, when economists and market participants observed an invisible force that can greatly influence economic activities and also like general economic activities and also economic activities in financial market, and can term this invisible force animal spirit. And this is to denote the instinct, emotion, biases that influence and guide human behaviors and decision making. So at that time, there was no measures or data, about this animal spirit. And the only way actually to do that is actually by consumer survey, through consumer survey. And the earliest survey across the global economy is the US Michigan survey, which started in 1946. And that has been the longest standing consumer survey in the world. About the Australian Consumer Survey. So the Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Attitude, Sentiment and Expectation Survey, or in short, CASE. CASE started in 1973 on a quarterly basis, and it became monthly in 1990. The survey consists of 1,200 Australian consumers, and the survey is stratified by gender, age, and locations. Consumers are interviewed by telephone, and then a mixture of telephone and online survey since 2016. Now, to put the Australian Consumer Survey in perspective, so the survey consists of 1,200 Australian consumers out of populations of roughly 25 million. The US survey, which is the earliest survey, consists of 500 US consumers out of populations of around more than 300 million consumers. Right? And the US survey is not stratified, and therefore the Australian Consumer Survey is valuable in the sense because it is a nationally representative survey. Now, the Consumer Survey contains two sets of questions. The first set of questions are related to consumer demographic characteristics such as gender, age, locations, income, voting intention, housing status, etc. The second set of core questions related to consumer sentiment. So these questions are asked in order to capture consumer sentiment. Now, in today's talk, I will also make use of another survey from the Melbourne Institute. So since the COVID-19 pandemic started in around the beginning of 2020, Melbourne Institute has run another survey called Taking the Pulse of the Nation survey, in short, TTPN. So TTPN contains questions in order to capture the impact of the pandemic on Australian consumer. And for this particular talk, I will use questions in the TTPN survey related to financial and mental stress and consumption. So for this talk, I will use the combination of these two surveys, especially when the two surveys overlap at the beginning of every month. Now, I will provide information about the current popular consumer sentiment index. So in order to capture or to construct the consumer sentiment index, the survey contains 5 core questions. And these 5 core questions are very similar in all consumer surveys across the world. And in fact, the Australian consumer survey is modeled based on the US Michigan survey. Now, the first question we ask consumer about their current family finance compared to 12 months ago. The second questions, we ask consumer about the expectations of their financial conditions in the next 12 months. The third and the fourth questions, we ask consumer about their expected economic conditions in the next 12 months and in the next 5 years. And the final question is to measure consumer current buying intentions. So we ask consumer to rate whether or not it is a good or bad time to buy a major household item at the moment. The answer to these questions are ordinary: better off, good, same, worse off, bad, or don't know. Okay, so the first step in order to construct the consumer sentiment index is for the response of each questions, right? For each of the questions, we're going to construct a component index based on the response to that particular question. Okay, so the component index will be constructed as proportion of optimist minus the proportion of pessimist plus 100. Okay, so for each of the 5 questions, we're going to have 5 component index, and the value of the component index range from 0 to 200. At 0, everyone is pessimist, and at 200, everyone is optimist. And the value of 100 is a neutral point when consumer are neither optimistic or pessimistic. Now, once we have the 5 component index, the consumer sentiment index is simply the average of the 5 component index. So there has been a lot of study in Australia as well in the global context. Document the values of the consumer sentiment in providing leading information about activities in the consumer sector, and especially in forecasting household consumptions. And in this slide, I plot the consumer sentiment index against the year's end growth in household consumptions. And what you can see is that the blue line, which is the consumer sentiment index, usually provide earlier information about the major economic event in Australia, right? And for example, in the early 1980, the consumer sentiment index started to fall well before the recession, and similarly for the early 1990 recessions. But for today's talk, I will not, spend time on demonstrating the values of the consumer sentiment index. So I provide you with the current popular consumer sentiment index. Then I'll move on to the next part of the talk, is how I propose a new approach to provide additional information that can be used in relation with the existing consumer sentiment index. So for the new approach, the objective is to capture the distribution of consumer sentiment, right? So in order to do that, the first step, what I do is I'm going to convert consumer response to the 5 core question into a numerical score. And this is a numerical scale that I use in order to convert consumer qualitative response into a numerical score. In my research, I have verified whether or not you use this numerical scale or different scale, such as 1 to 5 or 0, 5, 10, 15, 20. So the scale, the numerical scale doesn't make a difference in terms of the information that the new approach capture. The reason that I use this particular scale between 0 and 200 because it matches with the existing scale of the current consumer sentiment. Okay. Now, for each consumer, we have their response. For each consumer, we actually have his or her response to the 5 questions, and these response are now converted into numerical score. So it means that for each consumer, I can compute a sentiment score for him or for her. And the sentiment score for each of the consumer is simply the average of their score in the 5 questions. So what it means is that now I have of the 1,200 consumers for each of the survey, I actually have a sentiment score for each of them. Okay, then based on these, the 1,200 sentiment score, I can estimate a density, which provide the distribution of sentiments among the consumer. I will not go into the technical details of how I estimate the density, sentiment density, but now I'll provide you with some of the results so you have a feel for the new approach. The left panel, the bar chart here, I provide the consumer sentiment index or the consumer sentiment reading. And for this particular slide, I use 2 surveys. One is the survey in January 2020, and this can be classified as pre-pandemic, sample. And then the other survey that I use is the survey conducted in April 2020, which is the onset of the pandemic in Australia and also in the world. And in April 2020, this is when the whole Australia was in a hard lockdown. And you can see that the drop in the consumer sentiment in January, consumer were mildly pessimistic with a reading about 93. 100 is the neutral level. But then by April, the consumer sentiment index dropped to 75, which indicate that in general, consumer are highly pessimistic. Now, so the existing consumer sentiment index give you a reading for each of the survey, but with the new approach, so for each of the survey, I have 1,200 sentiment score, and based on the 1,200 sentiment score, I can estimate a density which gives us the distribution of sentiment among the consumer. And in here on the right, like the panel on the right, provide the density for the 2 months that I picked, which is January and April 2020. And you can see that like in January, the density is relatively symmetric. So you have a roughly balanced proportion on the left of the 100 line, vertical line, and a similar proportion on the right of the vertical 100, the line, the vertical line at 100 mark. But by April, you can see that the distribution now moves to the left, and it becomes a right skew distribution. What it indicates is that majorities of the consumer now become more pessimistic. So that is, in here, you can see the levels of the sentiment, but in here, you can also the change from a broader perspective, from the distributional perspective. The next slide, I provide similar information, but for 2 different months, January and September 2020. By September 2020, most of Australia were now out of lockdown. Victoria was the only state that was still in hard lockdown, but in general, the second wave in Victoria were some sort of under control then. And you can see that at the aggregate, so the consumer sentiment by September already recovered to the pre-pandemic. Now you have two readings very similar at 93. The right-hand side provide the density for the 2 months for the two survey in January and September. So you can see that like the density are not exactly the same. So you can see that like even though you have similar consumer sentiment reading, but you actually have different distributions of sentiment among consumers. Okay, before I demonstrate how the new approach, the density approach, is really valuable in providing extra information. Probably some of you may have the questions about how does the density approach, or how does the sentiment density related to the existing consumer sentiment index, right? So in this line, I provide the time series aspect of the consumer sentiment and also of the sentiment density. So the red line is the current consumer sentiment index over time from the 1990 up until I think by the end of 2020. And the black line is the mean of the sentiment density. And you can see that the red line and the black line are almost overlapping. And the correlation between these two series is 99%. So what we can say from that is the sentiment density is well anchored around the existing consumer sentiment index. But obviously, with the density approach, now we have the distributional informations, which we can use in order to understand the difference between consumer and also like the difference between in sentiment between consumer within a consumer group and the difference between different consumers. Now, to demonstrate the valuable distributional information from the density approach, I will make use of several aspects of the TPN survey. So the TPN survey have two running questions about financial threat and mental threat. So for the financial threat questions, the questions on the left here, we ask consumers to describe their current financial condition in terms of paying for essential goods and service, such as bill, rents, and mortgages. And the answer options are very financially stressed, moderately financially stressed, making ends meet, moderately comfortable, very comfortable, and don't know. Now, for the mental threat questions, we ask consumers how often did they feel depressed or anxious in the past week. And the answer options are all the time, most of the time, some of the time, little of the time, and none of the time, and don't know. Now, for the following exercise, I only care about two groups. So what I'm gonna do for each of the questions is that I'm gonna group the first two options together, and this form the consumer group that were under stress. And I group the fifth and the fourth option together, and this is the consumer group that are not under stress. Okay. So you have the red group, which is under stress, and the blue group, which is not under stress. Now, for each of the group, I'm gonna construct the density, sentiment density for each of the group. Okay. So the left panel provide the result for the financial stress questions, and the right panel provide the result for the mental stress questions. The table provide information about the traditional consumer sentiment index reading for each of the group, but I also provide the column, which an extra column, which provide the standard deviation from the density. Now, looking at the table for the financial stress questions, you can see that consumer who are under financial stress are much more pessimistic than a consumer who are not under financial stress. Okay, So you can see a much lower reading, nearly 10 index point between the two groups. Now the result here's are based on the KC and TPN survey between April and September 2020. So this is, you can think of as the first 6 months of the pandemic. Now, what you also notice from here is that you have a much greater variations in sentiment among the straight consumer, right? With a standard deviation reading of 48. Meanwhile, the standard deviations among the comfortable consumer is just 38. And the graph which provide the sentiment density for the two groups. So from this, you can see the difference in the density between the consumer under stress and the consumer who are not under stress. But the other thing, you can also see a very different sentiment level among the stress consumer. Some of the stress consumer who are actually highly optimistic. So those who are on the right hand side of the graph here, and there was a high proportions among stress consumer who are highly pessimistic. So who are on the left here. And similarly, you also see a similar pattern for the mental stress questions. So you see a completely different density or distribution between those who are under mental stress and those who are not under mental stress, and also a very contrasting difference in the sentiment among the stress consumer. What we notice from here is that the consumer sentiment reading of those who are under mental stress and those who are not under mental stress are very similar. But for those who are under mental stress, there is a greater variation in the sentiment among the stress consumer. Now, the next aspect of the TPN survey that I'm going to use is the questions about current and future consumptions. So in TPN survey, we, in 3 months, July, September, and November 2020, we asked consumers about their current spending, which is compared to the beginning of 2020. Is your total spending today a lot more, a little more, or the same as at the beginning of 2020, or a little less, or a lot less? So this is the question to compare their current spending, with pre-pandemic level. So the second question is we asked them about their expected spending in the 6 months from now compared to the pre-pandemic level. And similarly, the option for the answers are a lot more, a little more, same, a little less, and a lot less. Again, for these two questions, I construct two consumer groups. The red group contain consumer who indicate that they have consumed more or they plan to spend more. And the blue group contain consumer who indicate that they have spent less or they plan to spend less. Okay. Now for each of the group consumer here, again, I'm gonna construct a density in their sentiment level. So in this graph, very similar to the graph for financial and mental stress, I provide the table, provide the consumer sentiment reading for each of the group. I also provide extra information, which is the standard deviation from the density, and the graph plot the density for the two consumer groups. First of all, we look at the consumer sentiment, and we can see that those who indicate that they have spent more or they plan to spend more, they are considerably more optimistic than those who indicate that they have spent less or plan to spend less. But we also observe that there's a much greater variation in the group that indicate that they have spent more or they plan to spend more. And the graph here provide you with very different density between the two groups. There is a much greater proportions consumer indicate that they have spent more around the highly optimistic level. And similarly, there are considerably large proportions among those plan to spend more around the highly optimistic level. Yeah. Now, given that I have provided the result from the strat and then by consumption, probably you'll be interested in the consumption pattern between consumer who are under strat and consumer who are not under strat. Okay? So in this slide, I'll provide the spending pattern for those who are under strat and those who are not under strat. And the first table provides the result for the financial strat questions. Column number 2 and column number 3 provide the spending pattern based on the current consumption. And the last 2 columns provide the spending pattern relating to future consumption. What we can see is that it's actually 46% of consumers who are under financial stress indicate that they actually have spent more. And that proportion among the financially comfortable consumer is only 7%. And similarly, for the future spending questions, you can see that 41% of those who are under financial stress indicate that they plan to spend more, and that proportion for those who are financially comfortable is only 27%. So it seems that like stressed consumer have spent more and plan to spend more. But the other thing we also observe is that why the dominant behaviors of the consumer who are not under financial stress is to save, right? So you have a greater, proportion who indicate that they have spent less, which they have saved more, right? For the financially stressed consumer, we also observe that there is also a relatively high proportion indicate that they also have spent less in here, right? So you have large proportion indicate that have spent more, but also a relatively large proportion indicate that they also have spent less, and similar for the future consumption. And we observe a very similar pattern for the financial stress questions. Okay? And the recent research by Durante and Laurent in 2016 about the effect of stress on consumer saving and spending, they find that stressed consumer exhibits 2 dominant behavior. The first dominant behavior is that like a group of stressed consumers, they actually spend more. And the second group of stressed consumers, they actually save more. And these 2 types of behavior, either spend more or save more, are in order to gain control over the environment, or in a way to eliminate uncertainty from their environment or from their circumstances. But the paper, the author didn't provide what is the deciding factors that results in a very different behavior among the stressed consumer. Some of them actually go out and spend more, and some of them actually save more, right? So what we know from one of my previous slides about the density, for the stressed and the non-stressed consumer, we know that like among the stressed consumer, their sentiment levels actually is very different, very contrasting difference between in the sentiment level among the stressed consumer. So that is what I'm gonna explore. So I'm gonna split consumer who are under stress into 2 groups: those who are optimistic and those who are pessimistic. And similarly, I'm gonna split the consumer in the financially comfortable group, or those who are not under stress, into 2 groups: those who are optimistic and those who are pessimistic. Okay? And we'll look at the spending pattern of these different groups of consumer. Now, before we look at the spending pattern, I provide you with the density. Again, the density for those who are under financial stress and those who are not under financial stress. this picture look a little bit different from the previous pictures about the density of straight and non-straight consumer. The reason being, we're actually using different survey month here. So in here, I combined the result from July, September, and November together. And this is because these are the 3 months that we actually have the consumption questions. In the previous figure for the densities of the straight and the non-straight consumer, actually using the data from the first 6 months of the pandemic. Now, before we look at the spending pattern, first we look at the consumer sentiment index. Right? So you can see that those who are under stress and those who are not under stress, their consumer sentiment now at this point very similar, right? Very similar reading, but you can still see that there's a greater variation in sentiment among stress consumer, and the density basically tell you that even though you have the same reading of the consumer sentiment index, but these readings come from very different distributions. Among the straight consumer, you have a high proportion at the highly optimistic end, and also a high proportion at the highly pessimistic one. Now we'll look at the current spending behavior. And as I said, I'm gonna split the straight consumer into pessimistic and optimistic. Pessimistic mean that like their reading smaller than 100, and optimistic mean their sentiments reading or score greater than 100. The first observation we can see is that the proportion indicate that they have spent more among the straight consumer. Here, these two proportions, 31% and 62%, are much higher than the proportion among comfortable consumer, financially comfortable consumer, indicate that they have spent more. Right? So in general, like straight consumer are more likely to spend. So the dominant behavior among the financially comfortable consumer, actually to say, is they have saved more. But now focus on the straight consumer only. We actually observe two different patterns. Okay? So among the straight consumer who are pessimistic, their dominant behavior actually is to save, because you have nearly 50% of them actually indicate that they have spent less, or basically they have saved more. Right? Only straight consumer who are optimistic indicate that they have spent more. Like 62% of those who are under stress but optimistic indicate that they have spent more. So going back to the previous research by Durante and Laura, when they find that among the straight consumer, some consumer actually have spent more and some consumer actually have saved more. So in here, the density approach actually helps us to identify the deciding factors is the sentiment or the optimism level, right? Among the straight consumer, those who are optimistic, they are more likely to spend, and in fact, they have spent more. And those who are pessimistic, they are more likely to save. And we also find very similar spending intention for the future consumptions, right? And the only difference between these two tables is that now regarding future spending, those who are financially comfortable and optimistic, more of them are likely to spend. Okay. So only looking forward to the futures, and then those who are not under stress and optimistic, then they are more likely to spend. Similarly, for the financial and for the mental stress questions, we also find very similar spending behavior. The difference between the consumer group who are under stress and who are not under stress, and also the difference in spending behavior, among the stress consumer. Now, what we observe from here is that before, when we look at the first 6 months of the pandemic, the sentiment reading of these two groups are very similar. But now, when I add November, this is when all of Australia were no longer under lockdown, and you can see that when the economy opened up and the country were no longer in lockdown, it had much greater impact on the sentiments of the mentally stressed consumer. Right? So the sentiment reading of mentally stressed consumer is much higher than those who are not under mental stress. Okay, but the figure again show you that like you have a much greater or like very contrasting difference in sentiment among the mentally stressed consumer, and that difference will actually manifest in their spending behavior. So to conclude, our density approach offers further insight into consumer sentiment, particularly in capturing the difference among consumers. And this will help with the monitoring tasks and decision making at both public and private institutions. And our research offers an additional tool to complement the current use of the popular consumer sentiment index. The other result, the other finding that I have shown is that sentiment is really important for household consumption, be it current consumption or future consumption. And we show the very different spending behavior among the stressed consumer, and among the stressed consumer, optimists are more likely to spend, while pessimists are more likely to save. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Viet. If you would mind stop sharing your slides, that would be great. So I am mindful that we only have a few minutes for questions, but there are a few questions that have come in. The first question is the density approach that you have presented to us. The question is it currently being used, or are you planning on introducing it soon? So essentially, what are your plans for using the density approach more broadly?
So at the moment, this is my recent research, and the paper will come out very soon. And obviously, because of the space and the time that I have for the colloquium, I couldn't show other results, and how we show the time series could be very informative. And I would hope that you know, in the future, like public and private institutions in Australia will embrace the additional distribution of information from the approach and use that for their monitoring and also decision making tasks.
Okay, great. So I have some specific questions about kind of what you were showing with respect to the pandemic. So the first question I have is, have you been able to look at the correlations you showed in terms of spending and stress, how that might be tied to income? So is the spending and stress highly correlated, that those with lower incomes are more stressed and not are potentially spending more or less versus those with higher incomes?
I haven't looked at the result for by the income distribution. So at the moment, I don't have the result to answer your question. So whether
Okay.
or not by income
So,
group.
so if I were going to play a little bit of devil's advocate,
Yep.
I'm going to say, you know, what I'm wondering about is in terms of what's different about the pandemic versus general spending patterns that we might observe outside of the pandemic. So we know international travel is not available. Those of us living in Melbourne, in particular, have been super locked down. Those of us living in Sydney have been locked down. So we, you know, if we think of the ways in which we might use extra resources, I'm going travel's cut, opportunities to go to restaurants and go to the theater and kind of that type of consumption has been severely cut. Even going to the footy game, can't go there, can't do things like that. So, and then, you know, can also think about, on the other hand, you know, maybe I want to buy a brand new car, maybe I'll spend that well, I can't go anywhere. I can drive 5 kilometers. So why do I want a new car? So I'm kind of want to push you a little bit on this notion of what you're observing around spending patterns and being optimistic or pessimistic, given we are in a pandemic and our behavior has been forced to be changed as a result of government policies on lockdowns.
Yeah. So to answer your questions, what we noticed from we observe from the result is that, like, for those who are not under stress, either financially or mentally, so their dominant or spending behavior is actually they save more. So they actually cut down the spending, and you can see that the proportion among those who are not under stress indicate that they have spent less actually is very high, right? Now, those who are under stress, they indicate like you have a large proportion to indicate that they have spent more. And at the moment, we don't have the research question to ask them what they have spent more on, right? But from the research by Durante and Lara, and they actually find out that, like, stress consumer, when they are under stress, they go out like and spend more, but they actually spend on the necessity and the essential item in order to gain control over their environment. So what we observe, because the 3 questions we ask is most of them are basically during the pandemic, so we do not have the result for the pre-pandemic to compare, but what we can say is very likely those who indicate that they have spent more during the pandemic, very likely that those actually spending is they're on the necessity or the essential goods and service.
Okay, great. I have one more question and then a very quick question. So the one question is, we know that the Delta variant has really kind of changed a lot of what's going on. What do you think, if you were to do analysis using the post by 2021, do you think you would be observing different results today than what you observe from the data that you're using?
So I couldn't hear you very clearly.
Looks like we might be freezing again. Okay. I'm gonna.
So from
Okay, I'm sorry. It seems that I'm now getting the gremlin of Zoom connections. So I'm going to take this as an opportunity to say that we probably should end. However, there was one quick question, and it was, essentially the paper that you mentioned that you're writing, has it been published as a working paper on the Melbourne Institute working paper site, as well as the question wants to know, once it's published, where might we be able to find it?
So I haven't been able to complete the write-up of the paper in time for the colloquium, but the paper will soon be published as a Melbourne Institute working paper, in probably a month or 2.
Okay, great. So I do want to thank you very much, Viet, and I thank our audience for being patient today, given the various technical challenges we have had. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I do hope you have enjoyed this colloquium. Please stay tuned to see what our future colloquiums and events might be coming. And we're always interested in hearing your feedback. So thank you very much, Viet.
Thank you. And thank you to all the participants for your time.